Topic of our Dhamma talk this evening is Wisdom Part 2, and this then will be complemented by faith. And there is a certain connection between wisdom and the mental factor of faith. Now, to briefly restate what was said during the previous Dhamma talk, just the highlights, the main points. So we started out with a discourse from the Anguttara Nikaya, namely on factors that contribute to wisdom that is fundamental to the spiritual life. The first one among these factors was living independence on a teacher, and towards whom one has a sense of moral shame, moral dread, affection and reverence. Then, having done so, asking this teacher questions, then withdrawal in body and mind, so in other words, seclusion, kaya, viveka, chitta, viveka. This then, and wisdom will, being virtuous, then also conduces to the arising of wisdom that is fundamental to the spiritual life, and then learning much, remembering what one has learned, and then one arouses energy for the abandoning of unwholesome states, and one acquires energy, and one arouses energy for the acquiring of wholesome states or qualities. Then one does not engage in useless talk, and finally, the last condition is one dwells contemplating the arising and vanishing in the five aggregates. And that then will lead to the arising, all of these certain factors will lead to the arising of wisdom that is fundamental to the spiritual life. And certain a wisdom that one has not obtained yet, and these factors also contribute to an increased maturation and fulfillment by development. Now, quite a number of other factors were mentioned that contribute to the arising of wisdom, and one of them was association with a wise person, then wise attention, and actually applying what one has heard. Now, you might certainly remember that two factors are mentioned for the arising of intuitive wisdom or liberating wisdom. One of those is wise attention, manasikara, so mental factor through which we direct the mind in a particular way towards a particular destination, and the destination here is towards the arising of wisdom. Now, the other factor is unification of the mind, so in other words, concentration. And it was Marcia who had given a talk on wise concentration. Now, since we tend to have layers over the layers of ignorance, and with this then plenty of mental defilements, it does take the force, the cutting force of wisdom to then cut through all of these layers of wisdom. And it's in particular the latent defilements that are that lie dormant in the mind. They are there, and they are in an inactive state as long as there are no new conditions, external or internal conditions, that activate them. Once such a condition has arisen, then a latent, dormant mental defilement then will turn into an obsessive defilement, and this, if one is not mindful, might certainly even turn into a transgressive defilement, which means one actually, by way of body or speech, actually transgresses. So, with wisdom, we cut through to the very core of those mental defilements. Concentration is one of the two proximate causes for the arising of wisdom, because it ensures that the mind is well unified, and that the different mental factors are all focused on onto one and the same object. So it's the factor which fixes the mind on its respective object. Now, in the absence of this unification of the mind will be distracted. It will be easily pulled towards this object that occurs at one or the other sense door, then towards some other object that occurs maybe at a different sense door, and so it goes on and on and on. And so with a mind that keeps flitting here and there, one cannot properly observe the true nature of an object. So in other words, not being able to observe the true nature means not, the arising of wisdom is not possible. One does not gain wisdom, understanding about the nature of the respective object. Hence, the need for one-pointedness, ekaggata, in the Pali scriptural language, sometimes also referred to as samadhi. Now, Dhammapada, verse 372, nicely states the connection or the relationship between wisdom and concentration. So they are, as we shall see, dependent upon each other. So the verse says there can be no concentration in one who lacks wisdom. There can be no wisdom in one who lacks certain concentration. He or she who has certain concentration as well as wisdom is indeed close to Nibbana. So a person who lacks wisdom, who lacks a very simple, even the most simple form of wisdom, might not be interested in starting this kind of practice in the first place. And certainly this kind of practice might not be or might not seem very meaningful. And as a result of this, then it's not likely that concentration, wholesome concentration, will arise. Now, the nature of dry Vipassana meditation is that in observing what's ever predominant object comes up in the body or in the mind, and we speak of objects of ultimate reality. By doing this, or in doing this, again and again and again and again, some degree of concentration arises, and certainly this concentration that arises in the context of dry Vipassana is known as momentary concentration, Khanika Samadhi, and obviously wisdom, penetrative wisdom also arises. So both of these factors arise. Both of them in the course of the practice will gradually get stronger and stronger, and eventually in combination with mindfulness and certain effort and based on faith, eventually will lead a retreatant to the event, to the cutting through the eradication of certain mental defilements at the time when noble path knowledge is realized. Now, by now it certainly should be obvious that certain wisdom is what? An unwholesome mental state? Yes? Anurag? Is it an unwholesome mental state or a wholesome mental state? Wholesome, okay. Indeed, it is. And among the wholesome states, it is certainly said to be the most noble mental state. So wisdom arises in all jhanas, certainly to a limited extent, and certainly also and is associated with path and certain fruition consciousness. It does arise in some sense sphere wholesome consciousness, but not in all. It does arise in some sense sphere resultant consciousness, and it also arises in some sense sphere functional consciousness. And it arises together with all beautiful universal mental states. So when the mental factor of wisdom is present, then it will be accompanied by the other wholesome mental states. There's a total of 25 beautiful states, certainly in accordance with the Abhidhamma. Now, just for general knowledge, among the different forms of wisdom, we can differentiate between mundane forms of wisdom and certain supramundane forms of wisdom. So when we observe the rising movement of the abdomen, and we get to it, and the particular or some sensation arises, and we carefully observe this sensation, we recognize, this is tension, and then and there's knowing that this is a sensation of or the sensation of tension, then that would qualify as a very simple form of wisdom. No, the same thing goes for other predominant objects, including mental objects. And after practicing for a while, gradually the so-called first insight knowledge will mature and arise, and at that point a retreatant will then gain an intuitive understanding into the nature of physical and mental formations, realizing that those are two fundamentally different categories. And that certain understanding, that intuitive understanding itself, is also a form of wisdom. And there are many other forms of wisdom. I could certainly mention some of those, but it might be better if you try to find out yourselves in your own meditation practice. Now, just like with the other other factors, be those mindfulness or concentration, faith, effort, and others, they come in degrees. So at the outset of our meditation practice, it's quite likely that our faith will still be relatively weak, that our mindfulness will still be somewhat weak and not very sustained. The same thing goes for might go for concentration, and it also goes for wisdom. So the initial forms of wisdom are rather weak. In the course of one's mindfulness practice, and in particular during intensive retreat, gradually the strength of our intuitive wisdom will increase. And eventually it will get so strong that in association with the remaining enlightenment factors, that it has the capacity to eradicate certain mental defilements from the stream of consciousness once and forever. And that is quite a feat. Now, would you know any other activity that would bring about the same result? So let's say if you were to do psychotherapy for 10 years, will the same result be there? Not. Or if you play ping pong for 15 years, also not. So it is through this mindfulness practice, very focused practice, that this particular event becomes possible. Now, from a meditator's point of view, from an experiential point of view, there's a few things that might be useful for you in regard to wisdom. Namely, it happens again and again that one might find oneself having some faith in the practice, exerting some amount of effort, and mindfulness is on occasion there, and then the mind is somewhat and the mind is terribly concentrated on an object. So it's really fixed or glued to the object, but there's no understanding. There's no wisdom, no knowing the nature of the object. So, which means that at such a point, the other controlling faculties are present, but certain wisdom is not present. So one gets caught up in a mind that is very concentrated, very focused. This is good, but the most important quality is missing, namely the presence of intuitive understanding. So if on occasion in our own meditation practice, while we're observing this or that object, we find that we really don't know anything about the nature. The mind is certainly maybe concentrated, some amount of effort is being exerted, but we really don't know anything. Then it would be time to change something about our practice and to quickly re-evaluate and then practice in such a manner, observe in such a manner that certainly we really know the nature of the respective object. And not just once in a while, once every 5 minutes, but rather from moment to moment to moment to moment to moment. Now, is this easy to do? This is actually very difficult. So, at the very outset of a retreat, it's close to impossible, because time and again some disturbance comes up, and suddenly then wisdom is no more. It's kind of like, sorry to jump into a modern illustration, it's kind of like you're trying to work on a computer, you need an internet connection, and the internet connection is there for a moment, and then a minute later it's gone, and then you're fighting with it, you're trying to get it back. Eventually you manage to get the internet connection back. Again, you manage to connect and read, and then after a little while, again, it's gone. So this kind of computer work is certainly not very sustained, not very steady. So if we want to be efficient, then we need an ongoing connection. Same thing for our mindfulness practice. We need an ongoing understanding, knowledge of the nature of whatever predominant object that arises. Now, should certainly you find that during your interviews, day after day, you keep reporting the same thing, then what would be a possible conclusion? In terms of your wisdom is greatly maturing. You're stuck. You're terribly stuck. So one day you report certain experiences to Marcia. Next day you report exactly the same experiences to me, and then next day again the same thing to Marcia. So if that were to happen, it clearly means that something is not quite right in your practice, and that something is nothing other than wisdom. So usually when we practice deeply and we're pretty committed to the meditation, then there's always something new to discover, always some new findings to come up with. So if one finds that this is not the case, one feels a bit stuck, then it would be high time to re-evaluate one's own practice and to check very carefully, well, what is wrong here, what is missing, and certainly then to make the necessary adjustments. Now, a mind that is terribly filled with concepts, with judgments, with self-evaluations, evaluations of one's practice. My practice is at such and such fabulous level. Those kind of things will help your arising of intuitive wisdom or not. They will not. So, if you find any of those, also expectations, anticipations, and so on, you want to be mindful of those and let go of those as quickly as possible. So they really interfere with the unfolding of intuitive and also liberating wisdom. Now, there's yet another, and we're still talking in terms of practice from an experiential point of view, there's still another major point that needs to be considered and ensured in one's own practice. And what might this point be? Well, a mind or a retreatant that is applying excessive effort will find it easy to then clearly see what is see the nature of formations are not. As we know by now, excessive effort leads to agitation of the mind. And with an agitated mind, we cannot observe properly. So we can say that balance of the mind is another prerequisite. Balance in particular with regard to two pairs of mental factors, or more specifically controlling faculties. Namely, there ought to be a proper balance between the controlling faculty of faith and wisdom, as well as effort and concentration. So if any one of those four factors is either deficient or in excess, then it will upset the mind, it will upset the balance of the mind, and it will basically, as has been pointed out, it will basically hinder the other mental factors to perform their functions properly. So if effort is in excess, then concentration cannot do its work. When there's too much wisdom, the wisdom is far stronger than the faith one, and the wisdom is more of a cunning type or intellectual type, then it's very easy to deceive oneself in many different ways. Just as a general statement, we may think that we're pretty much in control of our mind, that we have a pretty good understanding of our mind. But in the course of the practice, we gradually see the deceptive nature of the mind, how it plays tricks in so many different ways. What appears at first sight is one thing, what really happens is another thing. Now, in the course of the last couple of, or in the course of this retreat so far, out of the 5 controlling faculties, the controlling faculty or the mental factor of mindfulness has been explained many times. The mental factor of effort has been explained. There were even 2 talks on this. Then Marcia has given a talk on why sudden concentration. Now we've covered wisdom to some extent, and what remains is the mental factor or controlling faculty of faith. And with this, we will come full circle. So with this sadhana, then all 5 of the controlling faculties will have been explained. Now, there is a certain link between intuitive wisdom and faith. And the link is actually very simple. When you do your meditation practice and you keep observing whatever predominant object comes up, and you get to know the nature of the various objects, then sooner or later, especially when an insight knowledge has arisen, with this some new understanding is there, some new discovery is there. One discovers something that one has not known beforehand, and with this our faith in the Dhamma then will increase. It will get strengthened. So with increased faith, there will be a greater desire to practice. This will automatically lead on to more exertion of effort, which will then improve our mindfulness, sustain our mindfulness, and this in turn leads to an even more concentrated mind, unified mind, and that then prepares the ground for the arising of some deeper level of understanding. So again, some new form of understanding. When that next level of understanding or insight has been gained, again one's faith gets strengthened a bit more. Again, there's a greater desire to practice, and so on and so forth. So those factors, wisdom, panya in Pali, and saddha, faith, or saddha is Pali for faith, those two factors are very closely connected. Now, what follows from this is also when we apply ourselves wholeheartedly to the meditation, and we have clear-cut sadhana experiences, well, then clear-cut sadhana understanding sadhana will be there, or forms of knowledge will be there, and that sadhana then will lead to the increase of faith. However, someone who does not apply himself or herself wholeheartedly to the practice, and therefore doesn't have all that clear experiences, well, with this, then as wisdom is weak, the faith will also be relatively weak, and then many skeptical doubts might be arising. Now, with regard to, or allow me to just describe a few of the most important aspects with regard to the mental factor of faith. So in Pali it's known as saddha, in Sanskrit as shraddha, and usually a person is said to have faith if he or she can subscribe to the Buddha's enlightenment, or can subscribe to the three refuges, or the three jewels, namely the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. Now, having said this, immediately one that needs to be pointed out that the faith should not be a blind faith, a faith that is being forced onto a person, but rather a faith that is reasoned and rooted in understanding. And rooted in understanding means rooted in our actual meditation, in our actual meditation and practice, and the understanding that arises from it. Now, different from other spiritual traditions, the Buddha very much encouraged inspection of what is really happening. He even invited people to come and see for themselves, eipasiko in the Pali scriptural language. And if there's a willingness to actually try out this practice, try out or try to implement some of the teachings of the Buddha at first, then sooner or later the results will be there, and to the extent that one tries, to that extent then some faith arises. One realizes that that one's experiences are very much in conformity with what the Buddha has described. Now, if one keeps on undertaking the mindfulness practice or other forms of mental development, or simply just leads an ethical life, one follows the 5 or 8 precepts, well, in each case certain benefits will arise. And those benefits then come as a confirmation that there is some veracity to these teachings. So the faith that we're talking about is not a form of blind faith, but rather a type of faith that gradually arises out of practice, out of experiential experiential understanding. Now, there's certainly the famous Kalama Sutta, a discourse that the Buddha gave to the Kalamas in Kesaputta while wandering, while coming through that certain place, and the inhabitants of Kesaputta approached the Buddha and said, "We have a dilemma." So there are all these different certain spiritual teachers that come through town. Each and every one proposes a different doctrine, and then not only this, but also denigrates certain the doctrines of everyone else, and certainly we are left perplexed. So we no longer know what is right and what is wrong. We no longer know what to make sense of. And the immediate answer to this was, you are right to have doubts about those certain teachings. And so it's this doubt about dubitable things very much this the Buddha encourages. Now, the more we practice, the more experiences will be there, the more confirmation will be there that indeed there is a close link between what the teachings are about and what is actually happening in one's own practice. And with this then, gradually an inner certainty arises. And also firm conviction. Now, with regard to faith, it is said that it is the seed of all wholesome states. The reason for this is because it has such a fundamental character, because it's one of the very first things that happens on this spiritual path. Therefore, it's certainly considered a seed. So it may start with the first hearing of the Dhamma, or it could certainly start by maybe visiting a traditional Buddhist country and certainly seeing the devotion of the people there, seeing how people live in accordance with the Buddha's teachings, and thus being inspired. Or for some, it's been just seeing a magnificently sculptured Buddha statue, or maybe just a stupa that then plants the first seed of faith, and then things develop from there. And that initial faith will, for the most part, still be pretty weak. But when we first practice, after we've overcome the hindrances, then some faith will arise, oftentimes accompanied by clarity of the mind, and that faith is good, but it's still relatively weak. Later on in the practice, again after having overcome the hindrances, a number of wholesome states arise, and certainly one of them is adhimokkha, namely having a determined faith in the practice. Now that faith is already much stronger, and certainly it will get even further supported when a retreatant clearly sees objects certainly quickly arising, certainly passing, sees the potential of the mind when it has this capacity to observe objects occurring in a quick succession, one after another. Now, if one then goes on to practice, and eventually the mind becomes certainly pretty purified of mental defilements, well balanced, etc., then and the realization of the Dhamma takes place by realizing the path of stream entry, path of stream entry. With this, one's faith then is said to become unshakable. Avijja saddha in the Pali scriptural language. Now, avijja pasada, unshakable confidence. So once certainly that faith, that experience has certainly taken place, and and with this, one's certain faith then undergoes a major change. With this, one has unshakable faith in the Buddha, in the Dhamma, and certainly in the Sangha, as well as certainly the practice. Now, no matter how much effort others might put into proselytizing, one will no longer be swayed by such efforts. The Bodhiraja Kumara Sutta, as well as other discourses, contain a passage in which the 5 limbs of striving are mentioned. And the first one among those is faith, the second one is good health, and certainly the third one is sincerity, honesty, the fourth one is effort, and the last one is wisdom. Wisdom, noble wisdom that sees the arising and passing of formations. The way that the Buddha explains those 5 qualities is as follows. Any person who wants to learn an art, such as maybe the art of riding an elephant, will have to possess certain qualities. And so a person who wants to learn how to ride an elephant will have to approach a teacher, so a so-called mahout, and then place faith in that person, have confidence in that person, confidence in the qualities, skills of that mahout as a good elephant tamer. Then the apprentice who wants to pick up this certain skill of elephant riding will have to have a certain will have to possess certain health requirements. So it needs to be relatively healthy, needs to be honest towards the teacher, and needs to apply himself or herself to the training. And certainly then, as a result of this, the apprentice will gradually learn the art of riding an elephant, and maybe even the art of taming an elephant. The same thing goes for us as we're occupied in, or as we're concerned with learning the art of mindfulness practice. And so this then requires an initial faith, an initial confidence in the teacher, namely the Buddha. Confidence in the enlightenment of the Buddha. Confidence in the Dhamma, that the Dhamma is well spoken, and also confidence in the Sangha, that of noble ones, that it is well trained. If we possess those certain qualities, then indeed faith is certainly there, and certainly this will be an important first mental factor. That faith is likely to be accompanied by confidence, pasada in the Pali scriptural language. And pasada has been described as a feeling of serene, of serenity and mental clarity that arises from faith. So usually when the mental factor of faith is present in the stream of consciousness, then this goes along with clarity of the mind. Now, the Anguttara Nikaya, in its Book of Fours, Discourse 34, gives a nice addition here. As a disciple, one has confidence that the Buddha is the best of beings, the Dhamma the best of teachings, and the Sangha, this is the Sangha of the noble ones, the best of spiritual communities. So just consider this last point. When living in community with others to whom purity of the mind and purification of the mind as a process is important, and who have achieved some degree of purity in such communities, overall there is less conflict. It's not always going to be ideal, but at least better than in other places. Terms that the synonymous terms that the Dhammasangani has proposed for faith are as follows, namely conviction, confidence, and trust, as well as clarity of confidence and or clarity of faith, and also the faculty of faith and power of faith, etc. Now, the characteristic of the mental factor of faith, as given in the Visuddhimagga, is placing, as number one, placing faith or of trusting. So placing faith in something, or trusting a person, trusting a teaching. Its first function is to clarify, and its second function is to set forth, as one might set forth to cross a flood. So basically, what this means, the second point, is that one practices and then has certain experiences. The experiences are so inspiring, so rewarding, so enriching that confidence arises, and based on this, one is ready to go ahead. So this launching is certainly there, this willingness to set forth or to cross over. So that's an important aspect in the connection with faith. Now, there are two manifestations of faith, the first one being non-fogginess, in other words, clarity of the mind, and the second one is a resolution. Now, just to briefly give you the gist of the so-called Sampasadaniya Sutta, which is the 28th discourse of the Digha Nikaya. This discourse contains an event that took place when the Buddha was residing at Nalanda in a certain grove, and then Elder Sariputta approached the Buddha and spoke rather boldly, saying, to his knowledge, there is currently no ascetic, no Brahmin who is equal to the Buddha or better than the Buddha in terms of his spiritual attainments or achievements. Now, immediately the Buddha, well, somewhat mildly, rebuked him and said, "How dare you speak like this? This is you're speaking with a bull's voice, or even a lion's, coming forth with a lion's roar. But do you have the skills, the ability to see the minds of past Buddhas and past Arahants? Do you have the skills to see the minds of future Buddhas and Arahants?" And to this Sariputta honestly answers, "No, I don't have." But he then justifies his point, and he's got a really good point, or several good points. So he says, one day, upon hearing the Buddha teach Dhamma, he was so touched, and it led him then to practice the Dhamma and realize the Dhamma. And there were many factors, mental factors, that he gained from this, and among them, very important to him was the arising of serene faith or conviction. And the conviction that the Buddha's, that the Blessed One's enlightenment, or a conviction in the Blessed One's enlightenment, having confidence in this, and also having tremendous confidence that the Dhamma is well spoken, that the Sangha of the Noble Ones is well trained. So basically, in three things, and he said that he was assuming that this would be true for Buddhas and Arahants of the past, and would also be true for Buddhas and Arahants in the future. Then he went on to say that he had that the Buddha is unsurpassed when it comes to his way of teaching Dhamma. Teaching Dhamma in regard to overcoming hindrances, overcoming mental defilements, so purifying the mind, realizing the mind. His ability to speak Dhamma in regard to the five controlling faculties, the five powers, the sense sphere, the six sense spheres, the seven enlightenment factors, the Eightfold Noble Path, the Four Noble Truths, and so on and so forth. And eventually what happened was the Buddha praised, and the Buddha said, yes, indeed you can present, if you present things in this way, yes, this is acceptable. And so that was Elder Sariputta's reasoning for having serene confidence in the Buddha. Now, to bring this talk gradually to an end, Amy has handed in a question in written form. Can you please talk about faith and the relationship of faith and patience? Now, over the last couple of days, we've covered wisdom. Marcia has spoken on concentration. Wisdom today, the connection was made between wisdom and faith, and now you're asking for something difficult, namely the relationship between faith and patience. I've checked the Digha Nikaya on any connection there. between faith and patience, whether those two terms get mentioned in conjunction anywhere in the Digha Nikaya, and there's no such reference. The same thing goes for the Anguttara Nikaya. However, both of those states, faith as well as patience, are clearly wholesome mental states. So they share this quality of being wholesome states. Now, we could certainly say, and as has been explained during the discourse, that with practice, faith arises, there's some initial faith in, let's say, the teachings or so. This gets us going, and then this faith eventually contributes to the arising of intuitive wisdom. And when we deeply understand the nature of the mind, especially of our own mind, especially of the defiled aspects of our own mind, then it is so much easier to understand where others are coming from in their behavior, and as a result of deep understanding, it will be easier to have patience towards, let's say, their shortcomings. So you can say that there is a connection between the deepening of our wisdom and patience, and there's a connection between faith and wisdom. So this much I can offer. By way of definition, these two mental factors are quite different. You might remember that the characteristic of patience was acceptance, and its function was to endure the desirable as well as the undesirable, and its manifestation is as non-opposing. So this is quite different from faith. Now, we can say that when in our practice wisdom as a mental factor is present in the stream of consciousness, then this is likely to be, or then adosa, so non-hatred, will also be present in the stream of consciousness, and one aspect of adosa is that patience. And when wisdom is there, then faith, which is the wholesome mental state, will also be present. So in that context, all three will be present in the stream of consciousness. So this is as best as I can explain for the time being. Please just take it as a tentative answer. If I were to have much more time, then probably a better job could be done. Now, allow me to conclude today's Satna Dhamma talk by wishing, based on some initial faith in the Dhamma, and or the Buddha, and or the Sangha, or all three, may a strong desire be there to practice. May this lead to the exertion of good and balanced effort. May this in turn contribute to the arising of sustained and strong mindfulness, and certainly may this lead on to a well-focused, unified mind, and certainly with those mental factors present, may much intuitive wisdom arise, and may the wisdom be penetrative wisdom, may it be wisdom that cuts through the many layers of defilements, and may it lead to the path of stream entry, and thus may our faith become unshakable faith. And may this happen during this retreat. And this is all for tonight.